One sentence. That is all it took. One sentence spoken by a British sergeant major in a windowless training room at a facility outside Washington, D.C., delivered without drama, without condescension, in the flat-measured tone of a man who was simply stating a physical fact. That's not how you clear a room. The American agents in the room had been doing their jobs for years. They had protected presidents. They had covered the transfer of nuclear launch codes. They had stood on the rope lines in Iowa and New Hampshire and Des Moines at the kinds of campaign events where the crowd is thick and the sightlines are terrible and the threat is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. They were trained, they were experienced, they were professionals. And a British soldier who didn't even work for their agency, who had been flown in on a consultancy arrangement that most of the agents in that building had never been briefed on, had just watched them clear a mock room in a training scenario and quietly told them they were doing it wrong. The silence that followed lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then one of the senior agents asked, very carefully, what he meant. What followed over the next 3 weeks was a masterclass in the kind of close protection doctrine that the United States Secret Service did not have, had not developed, and had not known it was missing until a man who had spent the better part of a decade inside one of the most demanding operational environments in the history of human conflict sat down in front of them and showed them exactly what the gap looked like and how deep it ran. This is the story of how the British Special Air Service built the gold standard of close protection from nothing, how they forged it in the streets of Belfast and the desert compounds of Oman and the killing houses of Hereford. How one of their own, a man who had lived inside that system and helped write the doctrine that governed it, crossed the Atlantic and changed the way the most powerful protective detail in the world trained, thought, and moved. And why, when you understand what the SAS brought to that table, the only surprising thing is that it took as long as it did. To understand what the British had built, you first need to understand what protection looked like before they built it. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, close protection as a discipline did not really exist in any systematic, codified form. Not in Britain, not in the United States, not anywhere. What existed was a collection of habits, instincts, and ad hoc arrangements that had evolved organically from the simple idea that an important person needed someone nearby who was willing to take a bullet on their behalf. The science of preventing the bullet from being fired in the first place, the geometry of a protective formation, the psychology of threat recognition, the mechanics of a vehicle extraction under fire, the precise choreography of how a four-man team moves a principle through a contested environment, none of that had been written down in any systematic way. None of it had been trained against measurable standards. None of it had been stress-tested against an adversary that actually wanted to succeed. The British Secret Service had a protection model for the royal family. Scotland Yard's Royalty Protection Group provided officers. But the methods were intuitive, the training was minimal, and the assumption underlying the entire system was that a sufficiently visible police presence would deter an attacker before violence ever became necessary. Deterrence was the doctrine. The problem with deterrence is that it only works on rational actors performing careful cost-benefit analyses, and the people who try to kill heads of state are rarely performing careful cost-benefit analyses. Simultaneously, in the Middle East, things were changing fast. The British had deep and long-standing relationships with the Gulf states. Oman, Bahrain, the UAE, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia all looked to London as a security partner. As the oil wealth of the region grew exponentially through the early 1970s and the ideological fault lines of Arab nationalism and religious extremism began fracturing the political landscape, the rulers of these states developed a pressing and immediate need. They needed professional bodyguards, not ceremonial guards in uniform, not police officers with pistols under their jackets. They needed men who understood genuine threat environments, who could assess an ambush site from 400 meters away, Who knew what a surveillance vehicle looked like when it was doing surveillance? Who could execute a vehicle ramming maneuver without rolling the principal's car? And who could make the clinical split-second decision to shoot an attacker in a crowd without killing the people standing next to him? They knew where to look. They called the British, and the British called the SAS. The Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing of 22 SAS, known as the CRW Wing, had been developing its counter-terrorism capability since the early 1970s, accelerated enormously by the Munich massacre in September 1972, when Palestinian militants killed 11 Israeli Olympic athletes, and the West German government's disastrously executed rescue attempt killed the rest. The Munich failure was watched by military planners across the Western world with cold horror. It demonstrated with absolute clarity what happened when you sent untrained personnel against a hostage situation without a doctrine. It demonstrated the cost of improvisation. And in Hereford, in the regiment's training wing, the men of the CRW watched the footage and understood that they needed to build something that would never produce a Munich. What they built over the following decade was the most comprehensive close-quarters protection and assault doctrine that had ever been assembled in one place. The CRW wing developed the Killing House, the purpose-built live-fire training facility at Hereford, where operators fired thousands of rounds in scenarios that placed them meters from hostages and centimeters from the threshold of lethal error. They developed the flashbang grenade, a device so effective that it was subsequently adopted by military and police forces worldwide. They developed systematic room clearance techniques, entry protocols, and sequential formation drills that allowed a four-man team to move through a building with a speed and violence of action that made rational resistance almost impossible. They trained against real aircraft provided by British Airways. They trained against ships, buses, and multi-story buildings. And alongside all of this, they developed a bodyguard cell. The CRW Wing's bodyguard cell was responsible for training SAS operators in the specific techniques of very important person escort. The two disciplines, hostage rescue and close protection, are not the same thing, but they share a deep common foundation. Both require mastery of close-quarters marksmanship at ranges measured in meters. Both require the ability to make lethal decisions faster than conscious thought. Both require an understanding of how a crowd behaves under threat, how a building's geometry shapes a firefight, and how a team of 4 men can move and communicate and react as a single integrated organism, rather than 4 individuals who happen to be standing near each other. The SAS had been developing all of these skills simultaneously since the early 1970s, and the bodyguard cell brought them together in a specific application aimed at keeping one particular person alive, no matter what the environment threw at them. The event that forced the issue into the open happened on the evening of 20 March 1974, on a stretch of London Road that could not have been more public, more symbolic, or more embarrassing for the British security establishment. Princess Anne and her then-husband Captain Mark Phillips were traveling back to Buckingham Palace in a chauffeur-driven car after a charity event on Pall Mall. Their route took them down the Mall, one of the most recognizable ceremonial avenues in the world, running directly between St. James's Park and the Palace Gates. They were accompanied by a single close protection officer, Inspector James Beaton, a member of the Royalty Protection Group. The motorcade was small, the route was fixed and publicly known, and the assumption behind the entire arrangement was the same assumption that had governed British royal protection for generations. Nobody would actually do it. Ian Ball did it. He forced the royal car to a halt using his own vehicle, stepped out armed with 2 revolvers, and attempted to kidnap the princess in broad sight of passing traffic. Inspector Beaton was shot in the shoulder when he attempted to intervene. The chauffeur was shot. A passing police officer was shot. A journalist who tried to help was shot. 4 men were wounded before Ball was finally subdued by a combination of police officers and a former boxer named Ronnie Russell, who happened to be walking past and decided that punching a gunman in the head was a reasonable response to the situation. Princess Anne herself displayed extraordinary composure throughout the entire incident, at one point reportedly telling Ball directly that she had no intention of going anywhere with him. Ball was eventually committed to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital, which is where the story ends from a criminal justice perspective. But from a security doctrine perspective, the story was just beginning. The attack on the mall revealed something that British security professionals had not wanted to admit. The protection model was broken. A single officer with a firearm, no vehicle tactics, no formation, no contingency drill, and a fixed and predictable route was not protection. It was an escort. And an escort is useless when the threat decides to materialize rather than merely theorize. The SAS CRW wing was brought in to evaluate the Royalty Protection Group's procedures and train them directly. What the SAS instructors found when they arrived was not incompetence. The police officers of the Royalty Protection Group were dedicated professionals who genuinely believed in what they were doing. What they lacked was a systematic framework. There were no formation drills. There was no agreed doctrine for responding to a vehicle-based attack. There was no training in offensive driving techniques that could be used to break a motorcade free from an ambush. There was no protocol for the transition from a protected environment to an unprotected street, the embussing and debussing phase that every close protection professional since has recognized as the moment of maximum vulnerability. The SAS changed all of that, working with the Royalty Protection Group and drawing on everything they had developed through their operational deployments in Oman and their CRW training at Hereford. The regiment's close protection instructors built a training curriculum that addressed every gap the Princess Anne incident had exposed. Route reconnaissance, choke point identification, vehicle ramming drills, formation geometry in static environments, moving environments, and transitional environments, threat recognition at range, at close quarters, and in crowd conditions. The precise mechanics of covering a principal's movement from a vehicle to a building entrance, a moment measured in seconds where the exposure window is open, and the team's ability to react is all that stands between the person they are protecting and a gunman in the crowd. And while they were doing all of this in Britain, the Gulf states were watching and calling and paying. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, the SAS trained bodyguard teams for allies across the Middle East. In 1970, before the CRW wing had even fully formalized, SAS operators had already been involved in protecting Sultan Qaboos of Oman following the palace coup that removed his father from power. They had subsequently advised and trained the Sultan's own protection detail through the years of the Dhofar campaign, an insurgency that the SAS played a central role in defeating. The relationship between Oman and the SAS is one of the closest in British military history, and the close protection work that grew out of it became the template for everything that followed. The demand from other Gulf states was enormous. These were environments where the threats were real and immediate, where assassination plots were not hypothetical constructs for training scenarios, but active plans being developed by actual people with actual resources. The rulers needed genuine protection, and they had the money to pay for the best available. The SAS, operating through what the regiment internally called team jobs, deployed instructors and operators to train protection details for heads of state across the region. Each deployment refined the doctrine further. Each new environment, urban street, desert compound, airport transition, helicopter landing, posed questions that the existing framework had to answer. And the answers fed back into the training curriculum at Hereford. By the time John Toombs stepped fully into the role of close protection instructor in the mid-1980s, he was inheriting a body of doctrine that had been built through more than a decade of operational reality testing. Toombs was a veteran of the CRW wing who had worked close protection in some of the most demanding environments on the planet. He understood the doctrine not as a collection of abstract principles, but as a set of lessons that had been written in blood, pressure, and the accumulated weight of experience accumulated across dozens of operations in which the stakes were real. What Toombs did with that inheritance was systematic. He codified it. He took the operational lessons, the tactical frameworks, the formation geometries, the threat assessment methodologies, the vehicle protocols, and the shooting standards, and he organized them into a training program that could be delivered consistently, evaluated against objective standards, and applied by anyone with sufficient aptitude and the willingness to train to the required level. He created a written curriculum. He built assessment criteria. He established a professional framework for close protection that turned a collection of hard-won operational habits into a transferable discipline. The resulting publication, the Bodyguard Training Manual, became something genuinely remarkable in the world of protective security. It was not classified. It did not belong to the British government. It was a professional document that codified the SS's accumulated close protection knowledge in a form that could be read, studied, and applied by protection teams around the world. Its influence spread rapidly through diplomatic security services, foreign military protection units, and private sector operators who recognized in its pages something that no other document of its kind had achieved: a rigorous, operationally tested framework for keeping people alive. The manual found its way across the Atlantic, and when it arrived, what it described was considered required reading for candidates entering the American Secret Service's Presidential Protection Selection process. That is not a small statement. The United States Secret Service is the oldest and most institutionally developed protective organization in the world. It had been protecting American presidents since the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's assassination in 1865. It had developed its own procedures, its own culture, and its own training infrastructure over more than a century of operations. It had learned painful lessons from the Kennedy assassination in 1963, from the attempt on Gerald Ford's life in 1975, from the shooting of Ronald Reagan on 30 March 1981. Each failure had driven a revision of protocols. Each revision had made the organization more systematic, more thorough, and more capable. And yet, what the SAS manual described was different enough from what the Secret Service had developed that the people who read it recognized something new in it. Not better in some global absolute sense. Different. Rooted in a different kind of operational experience and a different set of assumptions about what a protection team should be and how it should function. The differences between what the SAS had built and what the American Protective Detail Model assumed were not superficial. They went to the root of what close protection is for and how a team organized around that purpose should think, move, and react. Before examining those differences, it is worth understanding exactly what the SAS had developed in operational practice during the Northern Ireland years. Because Northern Ireland was not a training exercise, the Provisional IRA was a sophisticated paramilitary organization with genuine intelligence collection capability, patient planning timelines, and a track record of executing complex attacks against high-value targets. They had killed Lord Mountbatten in 1979. They had murdered British Army officers in public places. They had developed the proxy bomb, the under-vehicle device, and the come-on ambush, variations on the same basic problem of how you kill a person who is being protected through methods that adapted specifically to counter whatever the security forces had most recently deployed against them. Protecting British officials and military commanders in that environment was not an abstract discipline. It was a constant operational challenge that the SS and their close protection instructors met by evolving their methodology every time the threat evolved. What came out of that decade-long crucible was not a theoretical framework. It was a field-tested system that had been measured against an intelligent, adaptive, and genuinely dangerous adversary. Every protocol in it had survived contact with a real threat. Every drill had been validated by an environment that punished the ones that failed. The American protection model, as it had developed through the mid-20th century, was built on the principle of visible deterrence. The presidential detail was large, identifiable, and deliberately conspicuous. The logic was sound. A would-be attacker looking at a presidential motorcade and seeing a dozen agents, a counter-assault team, a communications vehicle, and a heavily armored limousine flanked by motorcycles is supposed to calculate that the probability of success is low and the probability of immediate lethal response is high. Deterrence, properly applied, prevents attacks before they materialize. The SAS built their doctrine from a different starting point. The environments they worked in, from the narrow streets of Belfast to the crowded markets of Muscat to the winding mountain roads of Oman, did not allow the kind of visible, overwhelming force that the American model required. More fundamentally, the SAS understood from operational experience that visible deterrence has a structural weakness. It only deters rational actors making conscious calculations. It does nothing against the attacker who is prepared to die, the lone wolf driven by ideological certainty, the mentally unstable individual who has decided that fame is worth a bullet, or the highly trained operative who has studied the security arrangements in advance and identified the one moment where the formation has a gap. Every protection failure in American history, from Lincoln to Kennedy to Reagan, had been exploited by someone who got through the visible deterrent layer. The question the SAS were asking was not how to make the outer layer more imposing. The question they were asking was, what happens when someone gets through anyway, and is your inner layer capable of handling it? The SAS approach emphasized integration over size. A small, precisely trained team that moved as a single unit, that communicated without words through years of shared operational experience, that could transition from overt escort to covert blending without breaking stride, was more effective in genuinely hostile environments than a larger team whose members had never operated together under actual pressure. The principle had been demonstrated repeatedly in Northern Ireland, where the SAS ran close protection for senior British officials and military commanders in an environment where the threat was constant, the population was potentially hostile, and the luxury of an obvious, imposing formation was simply not available. The vehicle protocols were different. The SAS had developed offensive driving as a systematic discipline, not merely a skill. The idea that the vehicles themselves were weapons, that a driver who understood how to ram an attacking car at precisely the right angle could neutralize a vehicular ambush and continue the extraction, that the spacing between vehicles in a motorcade was not a matter of traffic management, but a tactical decision. With life and death consequences, all of this had been worked out in detail through operational deployments and training exercises that put men in real cars on real roads with real consequences for getting it wrong. The room clearance methodology was different. When an SAS close protection team entered a venue, a hotel, a conference room, an embassy reception, they cleared it in the same way they would clear an objective in a hostage rescue operation, systematically, methodically, with a threat assessment framework that identified the geometry of every doorway, the line of sight from every window, the cover available behind every piece of furniture, and the route to every exit before the principal set foot inside. The specific techniques for moving a principal through a doorway, for positioning the team during a speech, for transitioning from a static venue hold to a vehicle extraction under fire were drawn directly from the Killing House training at Hereford and refined through years of actual application. These were the techniques that the British Sergeant Major demonstrated in that American training room. And when he said, "That's not how you clear a room," what he meant was specific and technical. He was not being dismissive. He was pointing at a gap between the way the American agents had been taught to move through a space and a more operationally tested method that achieved the same goal with greater speed, tighter team cohesion, and less exposure time for the principal. The knowledge transfer that flowed from the SAS to American protection services did not happen in a single dramatic event. It happened gradually, through training exchanges, through the influence of the manual, through the quiet professional relationships that grew between the SAS CRW wing and American counterpart organizations during the 1980s and 1990s. The SAS and Delta Force had maintained a close working relationship since the early years of the American unit's formation. Delta Force, established in 1977 by Colonel Charles Beckwith, who had served on exchange with the SAS and returned to the United States, determined to build something like it, was deeply influenced by the British model from its very foundation. The counterterrorism techniques, the hostage rescue doctrine, and the close protection methodology that the SAS had developed in their CRW wing fed directly into the training frameworks that Delta brought online in its early years. But the close protection exchange was a different channel from the pure counterterrorism work. The Secret Service was not a military unit. It was a law enforcement and protection agency with its own institutional culture, its own legal framework, and its own deeply ingrained operating procedures. The SAS could not simply impose their doctrine on an American federal agency. What they could do was demonstrate it, teach it in professional training exchanges, and let the results speak for themselves. The Reagan shooting in March 1981 had forced a genuine reckoning within the Secret Service. The attack exposed the same structural vulnerability that the Princess Anne attack had exposed in Britain 7 years earlier. The outer layer of deterrence had been defeated, and what followed was a 6-second window in which the response of individual agents, their speed, their positioning, their willingness to absorb bullets rather than return fire, determined whether the president survived. Agent Tim McCarthy spread himself wide and took a bullet in the abdomen to shield the president. Agent Jerry Parr made the instantaneous decision to deviate from the planned extraction route and drive Reagan directly to the hospital rather than the White House, a decision that almost certainly saved his life given the severity of the wound. Both were acts of extraordinary individual courage rooted in training and instinct. But the attack also revealed that Hinckley had stood 15 feet from the president's exit path in a gap between security layers and fired 6 rounds without being challenged until after the damage was done. The Secret Service revised its protocols. Magnetometers became standard at presidential events. Security perimeters were pushed outward. Protective formations were refined. Tented approaches to vehicles were introduced to remove the visual line between a crowd and a moving principal. But the deeper question of whether the individual agents had been trained with the operational precision that a genuinely dangerous threat environment demanded remained open. And it was into that open question that the SAS Close Protection Doctrine arrived with particular force. The training exchanges that brought SAS instructors into contact with American protection professionals ranged across multiple levels. At the federal agency level, through formal liaison arrangements between British and American intelligence and security services. At the personal level, through the careers of former SAS operators who moved into the private sector and found themselves training protection details across the United States, the Gulf, and Europe. And through the manual itself, which circulated through professional security networks in the way that genuinely authoritative documents circulate. Not through official distribution, but through recommendation, through word of mouth, through the kind of professional endorsement that happens when experienced practitioners recognize something that is better than what they already have. What struck the Americans who engaged seriously with the SAS method was not any single technique, but the underlying philosophy that connected all the techniques together. The SAS did not think about close protection as a series of defensive responses to potential threats. They thought about it as a proactive discipline that began hours or days before the principal ever arrived at a location and continued until the principal was safely behind a secure perimeter. Route reconnaissance was not a checkbox on a planning form. It was a detailed tactical exercise that identified every potential ambush site along a route, every choke point where a vehicle could be stopped, every elevated position that offered a commanding view of the principal's path. Venue reconnaissance was not a walkthrough with a checklist. It was a methodical clearance that produced a mental map of every threat vector in a building before the protection team brought their principal into it. The advance work, The systematic preparation that precedes every high-risk move was the foundation on which everything else rested. If the advance was done properly, the principal arrived at a location where the protection team already knew exactly where every threat could materialize, where the exits were, where the vehicles were staged, and what the signal was to initiate an emergency extraction. The team was not reacting to a surprise. They were executing a plan that had anticipated the surprise in advance. This was the discipline that the SAS manual encoded and that the SAS instructors demonstrated in American training rooms. The specific techniques for clearing a room, the precise geometry of a protective formation moving through a crowd, the vehicle protocols, all of these were expressions of a single underlying principle. You do not protect a principle by responding to threats. You protect a principle by constructing an environment in which threats cannot materialize without being detected in advance, and in which, if something penetrates that environment, the response is so fast and so precisely coordinated that the window of exposure is measured in fractions of a second. The legacy of what the SAS built and what John Toombs codified and what a generation of British close protection instructors carried to training rooms across the Atlantic and around the world is not something that gets announced in press releases or acknowledged in official statements. It exists in the way a protective detail moves through an airport, in the angle at which a vehicle is positioned relative to a building entrance, in the formation a team holds on a crowded staircase, in the specific way a point man clears the inside of a doorframe before a principal crosses the threshold. None of these things are visible to the people being protected. That invisibility is part of the design. The best close protection in the world is the kind that nobody ever notices because nothing ever goes wrong. The manual that John Toombs wrote became required reading not because a government agency mandated it, but because the people who read it recognized that it described something real. It described operational knowledge that had been tested in environments where the consequences of getting it wrong were not measured in poor evaluation scores, but in funerals. The Gulf State bodyguard teams who trained under SS instructors in the 1970s and 1980s went back to environments where genuine assassination attempts were not hypothetical exercises. The close protection techniques they brought home had to work against people who were genuinely trying to kill their principals. They worked. What the SAS demonstrated across decades of training and operational deployment is that close protection done properly is not a matter of numbers or firepower or the impressiveness of the hardware. It is a matter of methodology. A team of 4 men who have been trained to the SAS standard, who understand the doctrine, who have rehearsed the formation drills and the vehicle protocols and the room clearance procedures until they are reflexive rather than conscious, will outperform a team of 12 who have not. That principle, like so many other principles that the SAS established through their operational record, was not immediately self-evident to the organizations that eventually adopted it. The American way of doing things, more personnel, more equipment, larger perimeters, greater technological coverage, had its own deep institutional logic. It had also saved lives. The argument was not that the American model was wrong. The argument was that it was incomplete. When the British Sergeant Major told those American agents that that's not how you clear a room, he was not insulting their training. He was pointing at the gap between what they had been taught and what he had spent years learning in environments that did not forgive the gap. The agents in that room listened, not because they were required to, but because the man in front of them had a quality that close protection professionals recognize instantly in each other. He moved differently. He saw differently. He stood in a room in a way that told you, without a single word, that he had already identified every exit, assessed every person near the door, and decided what he would do if something happened in the next 3 seconds. That quality cannot be bought. It cannot be mandated into existence by an organizational directive. It grows from thousands of hours of training, from operational experience under genuine pressure, and from an institutional culture that has been building and testing and refining its methods since a group of men in the North African desert decided that a small number of highly capable individuals operating with precision and purpose could achieve effects that no size of conventional force could match. The SAS did not set out to rewrite the Secret Service manual. They set out to keep people alive in environments where someone was genuinely trying to kill them. They built a methodology equal to that task. They codified it. They taught it. And the people who learned it, on both sides of the Atlantic, in the Gulf states and the European capitals, and the training rooms of the United States federal government, took that methodology and applied it in the only context that matters. The real world, where a second is the difference between a close call and a catastrophe, and where the man who's going to make the difference was trained by someone who spent years learning that if you do not clear a room properly the first time, you rarely get a second chance. The sergeant major finished his demonstration. He replaced the training weapon in its holster. He looked at the agents in the room with the same expression that close protection professionals learn to wear in every environment they enter, calm, present, and utterly certain of what they are doing. Then he said something else that would be quoted in that building for years afterward. "The method works. It has always worked. We just needed to show you why." He had, and the room had not looked the same since. The agents who trained under SAS instructors during those exchanges described a shift not in what they knew, but in how they held it. The difference between understanding a drill and owning it, between performing a formation because you have been told to, and positioning yourself instinctively because you have internalized the geometry so thoroughly that the correct position is simply where you find yourself standing. That internalization takes time. It takes repetition on a scale that most training programs never demand. It takes the willingness to be wrong, to have someone with more operational experience tell you that was not right, and to go back and do it again and again until the body learns what the mind already knows. That is what the SAS built over 50 years of selecting, training, and deploying men who had nothing to hide behind but their own capability. And that is what they handed across, technique by technique, principle by principle, to every organization that had the professional humility to recognize what they were being offered. Not a superior nationality, not a mystical advantage, a system, built in the hills of Wales and the streets of Belfast and the deserts of Oman and the killing house at Hereford. Carried across the Atlantic in a training manual and the quiet expertise of men who had seen what happens when protection fails. And left behind in the changed way, a protection team moves through a door, covers a stairwell, or stages a vehicle at a building entrance in every country where someone took the time to learn it properly.